In certain countries like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, women are so restricted that they aren't allowed an education. They aren't allowed to drive and have to wear long sleeves and head coverings at all times. The women of America are really very lucky. In 1848, a convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in which Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, as it was called. It stated 12 propositions requesting equal treatment between men and women. This was the start of the united fight for equality in America, the start of American women joining together to fight for the cause. On the 10th of December, 1850, Michigan passed the first law on women's suffrage, the part of the movement that dealt with voting rights. 21 years later, in 1871, the next development was obtained. The National Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, began influencing the country, state by state, to secure voting rights for women, believing that support on a state level would force the government to change things nationally. In America, the word citizen was defined as male, so women weren't considered citizens and didn't have any rights dealing with voting or government participation. In 1850, in Massachusetts, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held. Things then rapidly started changing in favor of women's equality. The women's rights movement provided for women the right to vote and hold office, own and manage property, and earn a salary through the workforce. After Michigan passed that law, women began serving as jurors in courts, alongside the men who were called for jury duty. In 1875, the work of NAWSA finally began to pay off when the first of 16 states passed a law that gave women the right to vote. 43 years after that, in 1918, the last of those 16 states, Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, passed similar laws. NAWSA continued its quest for suffrage, and on August 18, 1920, after their relentless pressuring of President Woodrow Wilson, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which essentially said that the right to vote could not be denied by gender. Before that, women were considered to be essentially just a showpiece, housewife, and childbearer. A Catholic clergyman and spokesperson issued the following statement when women began fighting for their rights. "We do not believe women are fit to have their own head. Without masculine direction or control, she is out of her element and a social anomaly, sometimes a hideous monster." They said women were too weak, too naive to think for themselves, that women would go astray without their entire lives being dictated by a father, brother, husband, etc. Women were treated as if they lacked a brain, or that somehow their minds were less competent than that of a man's. People seemed to think that if women participated in government, they would make terrible decisions and throw the country into ruin, or they would pick a presidential candidate unfit for the job of presidency. The women's rights movement showed men that women were intelligent and competent as men. It was then up to the women to prove themselves individually. Susan B. Anthony, one of the leaders of the movement, said, "There will never be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers." To put it bluntly, women were considered stupid, weak, not sufficient, and only capable of being guided, their actions just what the men wanted. Though women's suffrage is possibly the most known part of the women's rights movement, other rights were given, like the right to own and manage a property. This started to take place a while before the brunt of the women's rights movement. While America was first blossoming into a separate country from England, they still followed British law, in which all property was controlled by a male. Women pled for changes, and as the country was just developing, changes started to be made. It first started in New York in 1771, then Maryland 3 years later, passing a law that women must give consent for their husbands to sell their property. That was also the first glimmer of more rights being provided to women, not just in terms of property. In 1821, Maine allowed women to own and/or manage property for a time if their husband was unable to do so, as in illnesses, accidents, incapacitations of any kind. In 1835, Arkansas allowed women to own but not manage a property. Women could live in a home, consider it theirs, but without any say in the owning of it, they were just renting space, not the owner, able to be kicked out at any time. In 1848, New York passed a law that women could both own and manage property without anything going to the husband. The law stated that women could own and manage property on their own if it was granted them before marriage or after a marriage was terminated. Women were decoration. They were considered too dim to do what was right for themselves and others. Men viewed women as being a trophy to mount on the wall, a prize of beauty, not someone equal to them mentally, so people believed women were unable to sensibly manage a property. The women's rights movement also provided for women the right to earn a salary equal to a man's in the workforce, instead of mostly just running the household and depending on their husband's income. In 1920, a women's bureau in the Department of Labor was created because people didn't know about women in the workforce and how they were treated. During the Second World War, with much of the male population off fighting, women willing to fill their job positions were in high demand. Propaganda encouraging women to get a job was copious. When the war ended, all of the men who were previously fighting came home. Factories began giving jobs to the war veterans, and they fired the women or motivated them to quit. Many women continued to work, though, and in 1963, after voicing their feelings about the prejudice, the Equal Pay Act was passed by Congress to make it illegal to pay a woman any less than a man working the same job. By then, most women had control over their earnings. A year later, there came a law that made it illegal not to hire someone just because they were of the female gender. A woman of the name of Bella Abzug was quoted saying, "The test for whether or not you can hold a job should not be the arrangement of your chromosomes." Women finally had utter control over their income. They weren't dependent on men anymore. They could go and make their own way. Even stay single all their lives if that's what they chose. Prior to the women's rights movement, women were second-class citizens. They were decorations. Their rights were to be a good and loving wife, daughter, or sister, and to do as told. They had no say, no control. They were considered to be simple-minded and over-emotional, weak and vacuous. Entrusting property or money to a weak, dim person is a mistake, as anything can happen to it under their control. That was how men felt, not wanting an empty-headed person to vote or to control their money, as that was entrusting their future or their next meal to a person too stupid to know what was best for them. The women's rights movement established a whole new idea of equality, started to change men's thoughts of women from a decoration to one of their own species, equal in mind and body, but in different ways that could benefit everyone if women were allowed equality. Women are equal to men now. Women are owning property. Women hold government positions. They can run for president if that is what they choose, which is a long stretch from where they were 93 years ago, having just gained the right to vote. There are female professors, when before the women's rights movement, women weren't even allowed into colleges. Both men and women own property, and there are women in every profession. If the women's rights movement had never happened, women would be holding no occupation but housewife. Only those of the male gender would own properties. Those of the female gender would be entirely dependent on a father or husband's salary, and this project would never have been made.